In this video, we're going to be looking at my top tooling tips. We're going to look at tips, tricks, and techniques with 3 foundational tools here. My swivel knife, bevel, and my shader. So for shading, I use this tool. It's called a vertical line thumbprint. It's wider on one side, narrower on the other, and it has those lines in there. You can see that texture. Well, that's going to come into play as we start using that tool. This next tool, this is a checkered bevel. Now this one here is, you can see the checkering is that texture on the top. Both of these tools, all 3 of these tools are right out of our Deluxe Beginner's Kit, but no matter what bevel you're using, I want to find one that's nice and straight there when we're talking about your normal bevel that we're using on all of our lines. Now, my swivel knife, again, this is a Beginner's Kit knife, but we're going to be looking at things talking about the cradle up here where our finger's going, and then our swivel, as we're swiveling it, comes right there. Before we actually put tools to leather, this is what's going to set you up to do nice tooling. One, we've taped the back of this leather. Now the leather that I'm tooling on here in this video, this is an 8-9 ounce Herman Oak veg tan leather. Herman Oak being the tannery that this comes from. The 8-9 ounce is the thickness. Now, before we tool on this, we need to wet it down. So this is called casing your leather. Casing your leather just means getting the moisture content right in there. We have to have that good moisture content before any of these tooling techniques are gonna be effective. So as I'm doing this, I'm covering my whole piece. I'm watching how quick that water's absorbing. You can still see it's real light here. We haven't put any water yet, so it's absorbing in there fairly quickly. The more we get that laid in there, the better this is getting. We're getting that moisture down into our leather. All right, now it's taking just a second for that to absorb in there. That's telling me that moisture is actually getting down in that leather, not just on the surface here. So when we look at our swivel knife, let's start with how we're holding that knife. I don't like having my finger crunched way up in there. I feel like I don't have as much control over that. I also don't want to be way out on the end here. Again, lack of control. I usually come right about that first knuckle, just a little bit back. My middle finger and my thumb are going to be down here on what's called the barrel. But here we go. Here's this tip that a lot of people don't realize. Your ring finger, bring that down next to your blade for added control. By having that finger there, it allows me to really control that blade as it goes around there, and I can have my hand resting down on the leather. If I'm holding up here and floating my hand, I don't have the control, as if I get down here and really add stability to that blade with that ring finger. When we pull that cut, we don't want to have this blade flat like this. We need to tip that up away from us a little bit and pull that back. As we pull those cuts, we want to talk depth in our cuts. This is a big key right here. The depth in the cuts. I see people work and try to get smooth cuts and get a smooth line. Both of those are smooth lines, but they don't have the same look as this one does. The reason being is the depth. These 2 cuts have consistent depth. This one's very shallow, and that one's pretty deep, but it stops abruptly there. This line here is what we're after. We're looking for cuts that are going to start deep and then they're fading off light. You'll hear me use that word fade a lot. Fading is going to give us a smooth look in our tooling and avoid a harsh tool mark. When we're done with the project, we don't want to be able to point and see, oh, we used a tool there, there's a tool mark, there's a tool mark. We want it to be a smooth, even flow. So how deep do we start our cuts? This is hard to explain sometimes because it kind of goes off feel. The best explanation I can give you is the angle on the bottom of your blade. When I push that into the leather, we can start that to where that point of that angle blade is down to the top of the leather. Now as I pull that cut, we're just going to lighten pressure off to bring that fade. So lightening pressure is going to come from this top finger, just relaxing a little bit. These two fingers are going to be loose as they're rolling around here so we can have some movement in that barrel. Once we're pulling these cuts, we're getting practice pulling both directions. Now, if we have a big round cut, if we're wanting to cut really steep curve here, how are we going to do that? We got two ways. We can start by moving this leather and starting clear out at the beginning here and moving that leather around as we go. So I'm going to clear a little space here on my bench. I'm going to show you how I'm going to turn my hand here, get that started in that line. Now I'm turning my knife and I'm also rotating that leather. That can be a real freeing thing, is to realize that you can turn your leather as you're moving your knife. But that's a way to get around there. Some projects don't allow us to turn that much though. So how do we do it at that point? We're going to start at the top of that curve. So I'll redraw another curve here. We're going to start at the top of this curve. I can bring that cut around. Now I can go back to that curve, bring it down this way. Now I just got that nice round cut without having to turn this whole project around. Even when we're doing small cuts like that, it's okay to move that leather a little bit to allow for a smoother cut. All right, let's move on past our swivel knife here and talk about our bevel. This bevel can cause endless amounts of frustration, but we're going to break this down to a couple very simple tips that are going to smooth out your beveling and save you lots and lots of frustration, okay? With the problem that I see a lot of people is they try to match what somebody that's further along in the craft is doing. So they'll see someone beveling and hear them beveling like that. And the results we're getting is a nice smooth line. If you're getting started and you're trying to bevel and you're trying to keep up that pace and you're hitting really fast but not moving evenly with your actual bevel, that's where it gets to be the problem. So when we're looking for that tempo, start slow. Starting slow is going to really help you move along and save you a ton of time going back and having to redo your bevel work. Because if we get choppy lines, you can always go back and touch them up. However, it takes time and it's harder to redo than it is to do right the first time. So we're just going to slow down here. Hit that tool, let it pick up out of there and move it slightly. See how when I slow down, my hitting slows down, but I'm moving consistently. The movement of my tool is consistent with how I'm hitting with my maul. Now, as you get more comfortable, that's going to speed up. Now, talking about fade here, this line that was cut all the way, it gets beveled all the way. This line that was faded out when I cut it is a whole lot easier to fade out when I bevel it. And that's the thing when we're building anything. When we're talking about building a pattern with your tools here, the better we do one step and the more efficient we get at that, the easier it's going to be to do the next one. That's why looking at these three tools, this is going to set the foundation for smooth, attractive tooling. That's what we're after. I'm not worried about all your detail tools yet, because those can vary and really bring out a lot of differences in your tooling. But getting this solid foundation is very, very important. Now, let's talk about tipping this tool. I'm going to cut a couple more lines here, so we have some lines to work with. I'm cutting curves because there's rarely straight lines in tooling unless we're running a border. So if we have a straight border out here, that's when you're going to run into straight lines. Within all your floral work and stuff, more than likely all those lines are going to have some curves to them. So no matter what we're putting in here, there's going to be curves. So that's why we're looking at those lines right now. All right, beveling, we're keeping that bevel straight up and down. If I get to tipping this bevel and have it tipped off to the side too much, even hitting consistently and moving slowly, you're still going to get those choppy lines. And even when you've heard keep it straight up and down and you understand to keep that straight up and down, I find that people will get to tipping that as they're going. And when I'm watching them tool, they'll be tooling down a longer line like this. See what I just did with that bevel? I never moved my hand. I started out kind of smooth, and then as we went, it got choppier and choppier. The reason being is I never moved my hand. So when we're looking at eliminating some of that choppiness, remember to walk your hand down there. I'm going a little bit at a time, but now I need to reset my hand so I can pull that back. Just like our swivel knife, we talk about that ring finger. That ring finger is going to come into play here as we're beveling and running this tool too. But that pinky and that hand is anchored down here, giving some stability to my tool so I'm not wandering around with that. If I'm trying to tool and just hold my whole hand up here and we're hitting this down, it's hard. Things are hard to track in there, right? It's easy to get off that line. All right, now I notice my leather's starting to get a little curve to it here. I'm just going to grab that, kind of manhandle that a little bit and get that thing flattened back out. Now we're getting back flat again. That curling's just coming from moisture and getting wet and drying down there. The back of that is being taped. It's holding the back of that, and so as that water's wet and trying to expand, or that leather's trying to expand, it's kind of moving that direction. So we got to just flatten that out a little bit so we're keeping that flat on the marble. Okay. Looking at keeping that smooth. Again, anchoring those fingers and moving your hand as necessary, re-anchoring. Even if we think we're doing something right and think we know, like, oh, we know, don't tip that bevel. Well, that's, again, if I start moving away and I don't reposition my hand as I'm going, getting things tipped, or I'll start reaching this way with it, but not moving. So reposition so you can keep that up and down. Now, here's a little bit of a, I don't know, I wouldn't say next level trick, because this is one I had to learn right off the bat. I didn't have a chance to have a lot of different bevels in my tool collection when I started, so I had to get by with one that was about this size, kind of a good medium size. But when you get into smaller areas, it's harder to get that even. So when I look on the inside of this curve, if I'm going to be beveling around here, it's easy to want to chew up some of that leather. That curve's kind of big enough where it's not too bad. I'm going to make some smaller curves to really show you here. So let's make a couple of these. All right, so now if I'm trying to get around this curve, see how that's starting to chew up leather on the outside that we don't want to have happen? We want to get a nice smooth cut there. So as I'm beveling around here, my option is size down in bevels. If you get a smaller bevel, then it's easier to fit in a tighter curve, right? Because if this curve is coming around really tight, then a wide bevel is going to wind up crossing those lines, right? A smaller bevel we could reach inside there with. I like this tighter curve here like this. I'm going to go ahead and cut that little guy in there. We're going to cut another one that little too. Really show you what I'm talking about. So this one here, keeping that bevel flat, it's not doing it. We're covering up all sorts of stuff we don't want to cut into there. But what's that option if you don't have the smaller bevel, or if you're looking to increase efficiency, meaning being able to tool faster and get through projects without having to reach back to your block and switch tools as much? Let's take this wide bevel and make it a narrow one. By simply tipping this bevel, like I told you not to do over on these bigger, longer lines, we can actually make a shorter bevel out of it in these tighter spots. So to get around this curve here, I can tip this bevel, being careful because we're not wanting to create the big divots in there by hitting them at an angle, but I can tip that, shortening the face of that tool and working to get around there. So even a tight little curve like this, we can use that big wide bevel, tip it up, and work our way around there. All right, we're going to move on to our shading. Because once we've cut nice smooth lines, and then we've created good even beveling in there, fading out, following our cut lines, and faded out those bevel lines, now it comes to shading. This tool here, my go-to tool for shading, that vertical line thumbprint we talked about, is a great tool. But I don't want to hit it down flat all the way. This is a tool I don't want to see that full impression of. It's one that's easy to look back at the end of your tooling and say, wow, there's a tool mark. You used it there, there, and there. We don't want to do that. We want to get it smoother. So I'm always going to be tipping this tool. Okay, we're going to tip this tool either up one direction, to a side, and most likely both. So when I just tip this up like this and hit that tool, now we got a lot more depth on this end. We got that nice sharp line like we want. We're going to show you that in a second. But this end fades off. So you can't really see where that tool ends. It just fades out of there. I can even flatten that out a little bit and fade it further. As long as we don't get down and hit this back point in there, we can continue that line out there. Now, also going to look at tipping to the side. So I can tip out and to the side, hit that, and now we're hitting more just this corner. Doing that same thing, but a little more gradual, just like we did here with that line. Now we can see where we're getting that. This is faded back here, and it's also fading off to the side, kind of softening that line. So this one has a hard line all the way around it. We're going to soften those lines by tipping that tool. Now, when we do that, where's this going to come into play? Well, we look at these vines that stick out. They come out off of our tooling vine there, off of that main branch. Now I can tip this tool and tip it this way. Start walking this down just like a bevel. We can walk back up into there. Now we've faded off down this way, we've faded off that way, created a nice little hard ridge right here on that rounded point of that, and brought some pop and depth to our tooling, but faded this out and left it smooth looking. Now, the big difference in that, I see people, they go to put that in there and they think, okay, we got to tip that, we got to fade that off. So they'll really tip that and try to fade that, but it still has that hard ridge on the back side where that tool stops. And so they get frustrated and try to really fade it off there, but it can create even more of a hard line on the back. So even though we're lifting it up, lightening that just a little bit and flattening that out as you pull it back, we're going to get that nice smooth transition there. So when we look at areas like these here, we got a sticker vine out that way. Pull that back like it's coming off of vine work coming up here, and this one branches out. Or we'll look at a flower petal here as well. We'll have a petal like that. Let's even do a rounded petal there as well. I'm not going to bevel these because I want all the attention on this shading right here. I'm going to turn this leather so we can see the rounded portion of this sticker vine. Tipping that tool up and tipping it in a little bit because I want the hard line to come in and create this highlighted ridge right where that curve is in here. You can see I'm barely moving this along, but I'm moving it each time I hit that tool and being consistent with my movements. And now I flatten that tool as we roll around here and start to soften that back line and fade it down our vine work. Rotating that tool as I'm hitting it and moving it is the big key here. This is the one I see people, they have a tougher time mastering this. Once they do, a light bulb clicks and it's like, oh yes, now I get it. Now I can run that tool. I'm getting the smooth lines I want. Simply by learning, as we fade that, to flatten it out and start pulling that back. Nice smooth transition, no hard break in that line on the back side, only up here on the curve of that where we're wanting to bring that highlighted ridge and bring that pop there. Now, we want to make sure that ridge is up tight to that curve too. If we're too far down, it's not going to look right either. If we look here, being so far off there doesn't give you that smooth look as when we run it up close. Now let's look at these petals. When I'm running this tool, same thing, looking at that outside curve, fading this off in here. So now I was able to fade that highlighted ridge even and fade that down, starting it deep out here, rolling that tool. I faded this whole shadow line back into here and then faded that ridge right off into nothing as well. Now I'm going to come around this point, bring that curve around here, and fade it off up to that point. Now we've added a whole bunch of depth to this petal just by two little shading spots there, and we're pulling those and fading them back down towards where our flower center would be. I'll show you the same thing around this one. This rounded petal here, we're going to have that ridge be deep up here around the top of that curve, and then we'll fade it down on both sides here. So I'm going to start here. Now, whether you're using the wide end or the narrow end, just depends on which one fits better in what you're doing. When we get into a narrower sticker vine like this, I'll turn and use my narrow end. Getting into a bigger round petal here, I'll use that wider end. So we're going to get this out here, starting that deep out here on the end. Now I'm going to flatten and rotate the face of that thumbprint as it rolls around that corner. Do the same thing up off of this top one here. Rotate and flatten that as we work our way down. Now we've added depth in there. Again, created more to those petals so we can come back, take advantage of this blank space in the middle. Again, that shading, we need to have a difference in our depths. If we just mash down that shader all the way through there, we've taken everything down a dimension instead of adding that variation in here. This smooth leather, we're going to take advantage of that with our swivel knife. And now we can pull some of those decorative cuts in there and bring that to life. There we go. Just these 3 tools alone can transform your tooling. Taking the time to master these 3 tools will take you from a really basic beginner level up to an elevated professional level in a hurry. Don't worry so much about your details. Look at the foundation of your tooling. We get better at running that knife, the easier it's going to be to run your bevel. The smoother we run that bevel, the smoother these outside lines are, the better we're going to have following that shading. All 3 of these tools we need to get control over, being able to bring the depth and the fade to all of our tooling, and it's really going to take you up to the next level. Don't skip the steps of mastering these 3 tools.